Hi, everyone, and welcome to the third event of the Democracy Matters series. I'm Ran Abramitsky, a professor of economics here at Stanford, and as always, I'm delighted that so many of you were able to join us today. Last week, we talked about the challenges of COVID-19 to the 2020 elections, to polarization, to public health, and to the environment, and today we will talk about how the pandemic is changing the economy. For those of you interested to learn more about economic research at Stanford on the pandemic, the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, SIEPR, has put together a very nice website where you can find Stanford economists weighing in on the coronavirus effects on markets, businesses, policymaking, and everyday life. I'm delighted to host today an all-star lineup of 4 scholars who have researched various aspects of the economic impacts of COVID-19. All 4 of them are inspiring examples of economists who refocused their research and public outreach to think about the pandemic challenges to the economy and what we can do about them. Susan Athey will talk about incentives and investment in COVID-19 vaccines. Nick Bloom will talk about the future of working from home. Rebecca Diamond will discuss the benefits to preventing another foreclosure wave. And Darrell Duffy will talk about financial markets and economic policy in a pandemic. As usual, each speaker will give a 10 minutes presentation and we will follow with Q&A at the end. So if you use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions, we will do our best to pose as many of them to the panelists as time permits. So our first speaker today is Susan Athey, the Economics of Technology professor at Stanford Graduate School of Business and a senior fellow at SIEPR. Susan's research is incredibly wide-ranging. Her current research focuses on the economics of digitization, marketplace design, and the intersection of econometrics and machine learning, but she has also worked on several application areas, including timber auctions, internet search, online advertising, and the news media. Susan has won many awards, including the most prestigious Clark Medal for the best American economist under the age of 40, who made the most significant contribution to economic knowledge. Susan is not just an impressive scholar, but she also always somehow finds the time to engage with tech companies and with the public. Susan is one of the first tech economists, and as such, she served for many years as consulting chief economist for Microsoft Corporation, and now serves on the boards of many companies and nonprofits. And I'm especially grateful to Susan for being such an important and inspiring voice for women in tech and for women in economics. So welcome, Susan, and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much. I'm really excited to be here and excited for this great panel. So let's see if my screen share, does that look good? Great. Okay, so like many people, I've kind of repurposed some of my research time to try to do what would be most helpful in this great pandemic. And so I've had the real privilege to be involved in an ongoing research project with this list of faculty over here on the slide, including several economists like Michael Kramer, who have been working on vaccines and incentives for vaccines for many years. In the beginning of the pandemic, Michael pulled together a group of us who had different expertise, and we all have rolled up our sleeves to pitch in on issues around vaccine incentives. When we think about what are some of the challenges with vaccines, there's of course obvious challenges in terms of the science and the research, and those should not be understated. But today I'm going to be talking about the economics and the investment incentives. So when we think about getting vaccines more quickly, there's a cost-benefit analysis that you can kind of boil down to trillions versus billions. If we think about there being about a $12 trillion loss between 2020 and 2021 due to COVID-19, that implies there's about a $500 billion gain from accelerating vaccine development by 1 month, before even adding in mortality and health losses. And if you contrast that to any kind of reasonable investment number in terms of trying to get the R&D and manufacturing for vaccines, the cost benefit is very clear. So you might think that there's really nothing else to do besides say that there's a lot of benefits and to ask the policymakers to march forward. But actually, this is a more complicated problem than you might think. And perhaps surprisingly, we weren't fully prepared for this in terms of thinking through how to execute on the problem. So let me talk through some of those issues. First of all, normal vaccine timeline is that it's at least 3 to 4 years from initial testing to commercial use of a vaccine. And frankly, it's typically been longer, many years. And one of the things that's very different from vaccines and regular drugs like making a pill is that actually vaccine manufacturing is a process, and that process has to be carefully certified. And it's specific to a vaccine candidate, and it's specific to a location. And even making any change in one component of the supply chain requires retesting and recertification. And since one of the things you're often doing, depending on what kind of vaccine it is actually growing things in bioreactors, you may have to wait for things to grow to be tested in order to get through this process. So this should sort of help highlight that there's some parts of this that are really like R&D, of getting manufacturing capacity ready, and some of them are very difficult to rush. So generally what happens, because all of this is so specific, is that firms first go through trials once they reduce the uncertainty of failure, and failure is even in the very final stages of trials like we are now for some vaccine candidates, failure rates are still very high. They tend to wait until the trials are done and then start building capacity. Even after that, they tend to build limited capacity to serve high income markets at high prices, sort of committing themselves to low capacity and thus creating scarcity. And there's long delays before all countries are served. So what we might like to do instead is accelerate the process of installing and certifying capacity to make it happen in parallel to medical trials. And that's something that makes a lot of sense in a pandemic where every month has accelerating access to vaccines month by month has huge benefits. And so what we want to do is figure out how to create the correct incentives to take that orange arrow and make it into a red arrow so that at the moment that we know that the vaccine works, we can put it into larger scale production. So to do that, we have to go through a couple of, to think about how to best do that, we go through a couple of steps. And the first thing, which kind of shocked me when I started working on this at the early stages of the pandemic, was that no one had actually done this kind of obvious exercise before of figuring out exactly how much risk should we take. So coming back here, what we're arguing for is that we should install and certify capacity at risk, but how much risk? Clearly, we'd like to do a little bit of this investment, but how much and how many vaccine candidates? So what we did to try to assess that is we first quantified benefits due to the economic harm caused by the vaccines using World Bank figures, but then we discount those benefits because we think that either vaccines may be imperfect or that other treatments and better therapeutics actually already address part of the pandemic by the time the vaccines get there. And then we further model specifically that a large share of the benefits from vaccination come from vaccinating the first people, say the healthcare workers or the elderly or frontline people, and there's diminishing returns to vaccinating the rest of the population. We then look at the vaccine supply. We look at 100+ vaccine candidates. We calculate the probability of each vaccine's success based on data on the vaccine stage in the platform. We account for correlations across similar types of vaccines as also the vaccines that rely on a similar supply chain, and we get data about costs. And then we try to assess what should countries do. Well, then we would ask, like, what are you actually buying if a country or an NGO is going to go out and buy vaccines? And so when you read newspaper reports, you hear about countries buying doses. They don't necessarily talk in the newspaper articles about contractual provisions around the time of delivery. But time of delivery is crucial because early doses are more valuable. So the last thing you would want is a bunch of countries to sign contracts with firms, but they don't actually build more capacity. And then they think they're getting access, but in fact, they just have to wait. And it's going to be very hard if you think about it once you get there. If the company says, oops, I'm sorry, this capacity isn't really here, it's going to be hard for the countries to do much about it. So we're going to model the buyers, countries, as paying for capacity. And we're going to assume that they can contract and observe that the firms are actually doing the capacity that we're suggesting. And then in return for financing the capacity, they're going to get an option to purchase the vaccine. And so they're going to basically pay for the capacity, reimburse the cost of the capacity, and then get access to the vaccine at a time. In terms of figuring out what this optimal portfolio looks like, here's just an illustration. We're graphing on one graph the probability of at least one success as a function of the number of candidates that you invest in. And then we also graph the number of months saved as a function of the capacity added. And so, again, we're going to suggest that you invest in parallel in multiple vaccine candidates, understanding that most of those will fail and some of those costs will be lost. Some of the costs can be repurposed as well, but only with some delay. We then look at the net of this, and we look at how the optimal investment looks for high-income, middle-income, and low-income developing countries. And we suggest that, for example, a high-income country should be investing in 27 candidates in parallel. That's substantially larger than the most aggressive countries have done to date. We also see that even low-income developing countries would find it worthwhile from a cost-benefit perspective to invest in pre-installing capacity for a smaller number of candidates. But we also see from this analysis that countries have conflicting incentives. So high-income countries would like to take more risk, they would like to invest in more candidates, and they would like to build more capacity than low-income countries. And so that also raises some concerns when we've tried to think about international collaboration, because the countries actually would want to do different things and potentially bet on different candidates. Another aspect of thinking about international equilibrium and collaboration is trying to think about, well, what happens with collaboration and what happens without collaboration. So in this picture, we've graphed some estimates of what we think the marginal cost curve looks like for as we expand the amount of capacity installed early. And the blue line is what we suggest that countries should be buying if they follow our cost benefit recommendations. Under the standard economic analysis, we should see price equal to marginal cost equal to marginal benefit if this was sort of a Econ 101 type of equilibrium. That would lead to a high price and also a lot of profits for low-cost firms. We're not seeing that in practice to date. Instead, the prices that have been announced have been much lower than this. We're seeing both less demand, countries don't seem to be buying as much, but also for the countries that are buying, we're seeing lower prices. And that might suggest that what's really happening is that the countries are exercising procurement power, that they're basically, and that firms are going along with this in part to avoid profit seeking or bad PR because they actually care about social welfare, and that they're just taking cost plus a markup. That suggests that we may work our way up the supply curve over time, and that would generate a race among buyers to lock in low prices. But there's also an aspect that in the short run supply curve looks different than the long-term supply curve. And the more countries sign these capacity deals early, the more we can actually invest in glass factories and other aspects of the supply chain to make it easier and cheaper to expand capacity. So there's a little bit of a race for the low prices going on, but also perhaps beneficial investments that actually improve the quality of the supply chain. And that's someplace where international cooperation can be particularly useful. So from terms of policy implications, if any particular country comes to us for advice, and we've been talking to a lot of countries, we basically say, buy now at the current price. That's going to be the best for your country. From a global perspective, there's a clear win for supporting low and middle income countries to vaccinate priority populations early and to buy additional early doses beyond in order to lock in low prices. But if you're thinking about investing on behalf of a large group of low income countries, there may be some trade-offs depending on elasticities in your time perspective. So it's sort of unambiguous to invest early when there's time to make the supply chain more efficient, but later on, some of those, that we may put countries in competition with each other and they may be driving up prices. So the NGOs and philanthropies should be lending to countries to supply their high priority populations and seeking contracts that expand capacity. Finally, when we think about coordination in purchasing, there's also going to be benefits for holding down prices given demand through procurement design that captures rents that would go to inframarginal candidates and capacity suppliers. Let me just conclude with a few final comments. If we think about the next pandemic, we were really unprepared for this. none of the international organizations had a full understanding of R&D capacity, and funding had to be lined up. People were going around with their hats, trying to get money in their hats in the middle of a pandemic. We need to understand the global supply chain and understand how to repurpose capacity quickly and also standardize. We need a framework for international contracting. The concerns about export controls have undoubtedly held down investment. We have in our more elaborate work, we talk about how the contract should work. We also need frameworks for international cooperation that incorporate optimal portfolio design, better contracting terms, mechanisms to deal with conflicting incentives, interests, and delivery challenges that different countries have. And finally, we're also proposing to design an exchange among countries that engage in cooperative agreements so that a country that might have trouble delivering one vaccine can trade their vaccine for other countries while protecting the social interests that were the original goal of the program. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you so much, Susan, for this very insightful presentation. And our next speaker is Nick Bloom. Nick is the William Eberly Professor of Economics at Stanford, a senior fellow at CIPR, and the co-director of the Productivity, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship Program at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Nick's research focuses on management practices and on uncertainty. He and co-authors put together this incredible big data on over 10,000 firms from around the world, and their research gave us important new insights on the drivers of good management practices. Nick has also done the most impressive research on understanding the impacts of large uncertainty shocks on the US economy, and he and his team developed a widely used index of economic policy uncertainty for countries around the world. Now, Nick is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the recipient of many awards, including the Alfred Sloan Fellowship, NSF Career Award, the Frisch Medal, and the European Investment Bank Prize. In recent years, Nick is studying the future of working from home. Now, one thing that is important for context here is that Nick and I are next door office neighbors. So you can imagine that I'm a bit offended that he has become such a big advocate of working from home in recent years. So I very much hope that you will all ask him some really tough questions in the Q&A part of today's presentation. So welcome, Nick, and thank you very much for joining.
Okay, thanks very much, Ran. I will share my screen. And we're also, of course, campus neighbors. So I was mentioning beforehand, I see Ran regularly walking up and down my street. Okay, so I'm going to talk about working from home. So as backdrop, before COVID, newspaper coverage of working from home as one measure of interest was already rising. So this was like a technology that was slowly spreading out. So here's a plot of the number of newspaper articles that mention the word working from home in around 2,000 daily national, regional, local newspapers in the US. And you can see it's rising slowly over time. There's a couple of notable spikes. Marissa Mayer, I don't know if anyone remembers that, but she temporarily canceled working from home in Yahoo in 2013. I actually spoke to Marissa Mayer about a month ago about this. And, you know, she's a Stanford graduate, so that was in the media a lot. And then more recent, in August 2019, Mitch McConnell and Rand Paul, both were separate, somewhat bizarre injuries, or at least Rand Paul's was, ended up working from home in August. But this media coverage is nothing compared to what's happened with under COVID. So media coverage has increased by 12,000%. So if any of you are like completely fed up with newspaper articles and media pieces and, you know, tweets about working from home, you're probably not alone. It's reached almost saturation point. And, you know, I want to talk about this today. Even though I've been working on this for 10 years. I've been talking, you know, to many, you know, dozens of firms over the years. Even I'm kind of getting it, you know, working from home is becoming a bit much at this point. So I'm going to talk about working from home before COVID, during COVID, and then make some predictions post-COVID. So before COVID, we have fantastic data from something called the American Time Use Survey from the BLS. And we know that actually before COVID, working from home for full paid days was actually pretty rare. So only 15% of Americans had full paid days working from home. You know, the reason we focus on full paid days is it's really relevant for commuting and office space. So I'm aware that many people work in like mornings and evenings on weekends. We're really thinking about taking the entire day at home. And as you notice, Only 15% of Americans did that before COVID, and mostly it was pretty rare. So there was only 2% of people did this 5+ days a week. So it was extremely unusual to work from home full-time before COVID. Perhaps surprisingly, before COVID, working from home was very balanced by sex and age. So women and men had very similar ratios, as did people across different ages. I mean, I found it somewhat surprising, but it's there in the data. What is less surprising is it's extremely unbalanced before COVID, and it's true now. Working from home is far more common amongst more educated and higher earners. So on the left is kind of the most extreme. If you go from people that have less than a high school diploma up to people with a university degree and higher, their amount of working from home frequency goes up 15-fold. So it's very much before COVID, and particularly now, skewed heavily towards well-educated, higher earning individuals. So what about working from home during COVID? So what do we know? So I've been running monthly surveys of around 2,500 working age Americans each month. And here's a couple of months worth of data. So for example, in May, post-pandemic, when things had kind of settled down a bit, you see the working from home is incredibly common. So 42% of Americans are working from home. That's the largest group. 33% were not working, which shows you like how extreme the impact on the labor market was. Really, horrific impact, massive levels of unemployment and non-employment. And then 26% were working on business premises. You roll things forwards 3 months to August. This is the latest data. It's collected in late August, about 3 weeks old. Now working from home has dropped back, but we're still about a third of people working from home, and they're roughly a third on the business premises and slightly less than a third that are not working. So the labor market's healing. If you can judge by traffic on the 280, there are more people going to work, but still there's roughly equal amounts of people working from home as on their business premises. But working from home under COVID is very hard. Is far from ideal. There's multiple problems. I'm just going to highlight 4 of them that anyone here, many of you will recognize, many if not all of these. So the first is kids. So 57% of working age Americans have kids 18 or under in the house. I have 4 kids, so it's like massively distracting. This is my daughter, Catherine, my youngest, who's 5, just turned 5. And to me, she's very sweet, but she just comes in all the time. Even for a 5-year-old, there is only so much screen time and TV she can watch. And she must be on 7-8 hours a day by now. And so, with all the schools closer, all my kids are at home doing Zoom school. It's just hugely distracting. I know this is a very, very common problem, actually. In fact, reopening the schools is one of the big drivers of potentially, restarting the economy. Second fact is maybe underappreciated, particularly if you're a Stanford undergrad or graduate, is only about a third of jobs can fully effectively work from home. So in the surveys and in other data, there's a famous study from Chicago, it turns out around a third of people can work from home basically fully efficiently. That would probably include, me and I would have thought most other faculty. It's not ideal, but you can pretty much teach and research at home. There's a third of people who it's clearly much more problematic. They kind of partly can work from home, but some things they really can't do. So for example, if you're a doctor, maybe it's very hard to physically examine patients, or if you're using lab equipment or you're an administrator, you need to use computer equipment. And there's around a third of people that just can't work from home at all. And they tend to be lower paid, but not entirely. So there'd be a lot of, say, gardeners and, people work in shops and food restaurants, but also dentists, surgeons, pilots, etc. So, a lot of people this really doesn't work that well for. The third is space. So here are 2 Stanford students. On the left is Scarlett, who, I was having a call with her, and it turned out she was sitting on her shoe rack in the apartment she shares with her fiance. And she said when they're both on the call in the morning, she has to sit in the shoe rack and close the closet door in order to reduce the noise, and he has to go in the living room, and they swap around in the afternoons. On the right is Nikhil, is a former undergrad student of mine I was talking to, and I could see like a shirt next to his ear. And I was like, Nikhil, where are you? And it turned out he's basically working in his girlfriend's walk-in wardrobe. So in the data we see, 49% of Americans have their own room, which is not their bedroom. So most people are either sharing rooms or in their bedroom, neither of which are great. And then finally, as I mentioned, before COVID, full-time working from home is very rare. And full-time working at home is a big issue. So since the lockdown, I have spoken to, I've been spending a huge amount of time working. There's probably like 100 execs, CEOs, employees, in fact, multiple groups across Stanford as well. And the three issues that come out with full-time working from home. One is creativity. It's very hard to be creative and work effectively with co-workers. The second is, motivation. It's hard to remain focused and inspired sitting in your bedroom, 5 days a week. And thirdly is a real issue with mental health. So a number of CEOs actually, senior execs have raised this. I did a study, how I got involved in working from home is 10 years ago. I did a big randomized control study on 1,000 employees out in China. And we saw after about 4 to 5 months of working from home, mental health issues started to become a serious issue. So loneliness and depression and everything else. So these are all challenges. On the good side, working from home is saving Americans a lot of time. So the average American commutes for about an hour a day, 30 minutes each way. There are about 60 million Americans currently working from home full time. So that's 60 million hours a day that are being saved on commuting. We asked them what they do with the time. Around a third of people spend it to work more in their current jobs, which is, I don't know it's good or bad, but it's why productivity is held up surprisingly well with working from home. And then 2/3 is spent on your own stuff, kind of, mainly leisure or some home chores or childcare. So finally, what about working from home post-COVID? Well, working from home, so again, from two different surveys have been running, one of employees and the second one with the Atlanta Fed and Chicago University. We have a panel of 500 firms that we survey every month. We've been collecting predictions and from honestly talking to dozens and dozens of execs on what's going to happen. And the data is before COVID, we know from ATUS about 5% of days were working from home of US employees. During COVID, I just showed you 42% of people are working from home. They're almost entirely doing that full time. So that's 42% of days. Post-COVID, the prediction is something like 24% a day. So a clear drop versus now, but massively up from before COVID. So a 5-fold long-term increase. I think there's 3 stylized facts that are coming out on how this will work. The first is part-time but regular. So many firms I talk to have something in mind, like let's say Monday, Wednesday, Friday, everyone comes into the office. All your meetings, your team events, your client events, your leaving events, trainings, lunches, etc. on those days. Tuesdays, Thursdays, people are encouraged to work from home. And if you have, a big firm, maybe you split teams up and, 1 week they do Monday, Wednesday, Friday, next week they do Tuesday, Thursdays. But something whereby there's regular days in the office where all the group work happens and there's regular days at home where people are encouraged to work from home. Secondly, it's optional. Turns out around a quarter employees never want to work from home. They tend to be young, single, living in small apartments. So I don't think anyone should be forced to work from home. And finally, it should be a privilege. So underperformers and new hires, you heard Mark Zuckerberg made this point explicitly. Several other people have, new hires are probably not going to get to work from home initially. So, and those that underperform need to come back into the office. So finally, will COVID destroy the modern office? No, I don't think that's the case, but I think it's going to relocate it. So again, on separate survey evidence, we polled firms and their demand for office space is actually almost completely flat. So it seems surprising. You think, well, wait, there's 20% less person days in the office, but it turns out firms see some of the social distancing sticking permanently. So the typical view is they're going to see something like 20% more square footage per person. So total space demand's flat, but there is a massive shift from skyscrapers to office parks. So things like Salesforce Tower skyscraper in downtown San Francisco is like a cursed building. You can't get to the front door without taking mass transit, and people are nervous about social distancing. And then you got to get in a crowded elevator. So there's been an enormous, reduction. I know it's all today. New York skyscrapers, their occupancy rates are 10% to things much more like office parks and in fact Stanford campus. So Stanford is, relatively blessed. There's, most of our buildings can go up and down stairs, and a lot of people can drive, bike, or take a shuttle to work. So at that point, I'll stop. Thanks.
That was great. Thanks a lot, Nick. And I think after your talk, I will take less personally your choice to work on on working from home. And next, I'm very happy to introduce Rebecca Diamond. Rebecca is an associate professor of economics at Stanford Graduate School of Business, a senior fellow at CIPER, and a co-editor of the Journal of Public Economics. Rebecca is an applied microeconomist studying local labor and housing markets. Her recent research focuses on the causes and consequences of diverging economic growth across US cities and its effect on inequality. Rebecca has received the Sloan Fellowship and an NSF Career Award, among other prizes. The one thing that I find actually particularly impressive is that Rebecca has received so many refereeing awards from the top journals of economics, which in my book is a huge honor because it celebrates the unsung heroes of academia, those who are excelling in a job that is so crucial and yet not typically rewarded. Rebecca has an important new study on the huge and long-term harms of foreclosure that haven't been on the radar of policymakers. She and her co-authors show that losing a home can have painful consequences that extend far, far beyond the immediate financial cost. So thanks a lot for joining, Rebecca.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. Let me get my slides pulled up. We're good? Great. Okay. So I'm going to talk a bit about the benefits of preventing another foreclosure wave during COVID-19 and beyond, studying what we learned from the Great Recession. There we go. So as you may be aware, there is a growing mortgage delinquency problem currently in the US. This is plotting the percent of mortgages that are more than 90 days past due in the US, covered by the two main mortgage guarantors, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So this is the vast majority of US mortgages. So you can see in the previous Great Recession, there was a huge spike of very delinquent mortgages, and that slowly came down as the economy recovered. And now right here at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, you can see this spiking again. So we don't quite know yet how high this is going to go, but it looks like there's a looming issue that we're going to have to deal with. So we've currently just kind of kicked the can down the road. Right now we have a foreclosure moratorium, which means that even if you're not paying your mortgage, the bank is not allowed to move forward with trying to seize your home. They have to just wait right now. And what that means is we currently have forbearance, which means you don't actually have to make your mortgage payments right now. There's no real consequences of not paying your mortgage, but those payments are piling up in the background. They're not just written off, you got to make them eventually, but we're saying you can just have some time to figure it out. So how are we going to work out these delinquencies? We don't currently have a solution to this problem. What are we going to do? Are we going to eventually just foreclose on everyone, kind of like we did in the last recession? But alternative policies like restructuring your debt and modifying the terms of your mortgage are alternatives out there that could help banks recoup some of their losses, but also prevent a lot of people losing their homes. So looking to the Great Recession is a great place to try to get a sense of what are the payoffs of preventing all of these foreclosures. So there were 6 million houses lost to foreclosure during the Great Recession. And basically what this means is the banks wanted to recover the lost debt payments that they were hoping to receive from households. Households stopped paying, so instead of paying your mortgage, the bank basically takes your home. And most of this contracting had been thought as really just a financial transaction. So you have this object that's worth something, your house. The bank has some value in owning your house because they can sell it to someone else. But what's unique about foreclosure is this wealth and asset that you have in your home is not just a stock portfolio. It's not just some wealth that you have. It's where you physically live. So when I take your home, I'm not just taking wealth from you, I'm also evicting you in this state of financial distress. And that's sort of unique to foreclosure relative to sort of generic debt contracts out there. So we, in my study with my co-authors, wanted to get a better sense of what is losing your home due to foreclosure really do to you in the long run. And not just due to your wealth sort of mechanically, but change your economic well-being in sort of a multidimensional sense. To do that, we collected a big data set covering all mortgages under potential foreclosure in Cook County, Illinois. So this is the Chicagoland area. We focused on this one area because we had really good data access to all the detailed steps of foreclosure process. And what we're going to do here is try to find an experiment which will effectively randomly assign foreclosure to households which are delinquent on their mortgage. So you might think it'd be hard to actually truly run an experiment. That would be very unethical to randomly assign true foreclosure just because we want to see what the effect is. But we're going to harness the fact that foreclosure goes through the court system in Illinois. And because you have to go through the court, that means a judge is assigned to your case, and judges are assigned to cases using true randomization. So there's a bunch of foreclosure judges that work in Chicago, and which judge your case gets assigned to is truly random. And it just turns out that judges are a bit different. So some judges are more strict and are going to push a bunch of houses into foreclosure. Other houses might be more lenient, encourage you to renegotiate with the bank, and find alternative policies like encouraging loan modification. So if you get the strict judge, you're much more likely to end up in foreclosure. If you're lucky and you get the lenient judge, you might get a loan modification. So that creates an experiment which allows us to study what are the real costs of foreclosures. And we're going to be teasing this apart across 3 different types of individuals involved. So homeowners, this is sort of the classic case. You own your home and you live in it. What does this do to you when I take your home? But it's also interesting to study landlords and renters in this case, because that's going to help us sort of tease apart different mechanisms. So if you're a landlord, the cost of foreclosure really is more like a wealth loss to you. You don't actually live in that home. So we can study what is the effect on landlords of just losing this asset, which was this home that they rented out to other people. And then we can also study the effect on renters, because they're going to get evicted from the home, but they don't actually have much financial obligation tied up in this. So by studying homeowners, landlords, and renters separately, we can try to tease apart the mechanisms that are really driving the effects that we find. Briefly, how a foreclosure process works. So if you haven't paid your mortgage for more than 90 days, a lender is now allowed to initiate the foreclosure process. So that means they're going to bring a court case against you. You're going to get notified that the lender is trying to take your home. And then they're going to start this court case, which can go on for a long time. There's a lot of procedural requirements that go through the court. You could try to, renegotiate the mortgage. All the details of this can drag on for years. Cases can go on for 2, 3, 4 years. When the judge actually approves a foreclosure, the property will be then sold at auction. Once someone buys the property at that foreclosure auction, the new owner can then evict the previous residents 30 days after confirmation of sale. So this is and if the case gets dismissed, that means you sort of work something out with your lender, or maybe the lender didn't really follow the rules exactly, and the case can get dismissed because the lender just sort of messed up all the technical details. So there's a lot of different ways the case can get dismissed, but the foreclosure, if you get foreclosed on, you basically end up losing your home and getting evicted. So we're going to first look at what does this do to homeowners. And I'm not going to show you all the different statistics that we've run here, but this is just a plot of looking at around the year where they filed the foreclosure case. What is the average effect on the probability that you no longer live at this treated initial address? So we're finding that those cases that get randomly foreclosed on are about 30 percentage points more likely to move away from their initial address. And this is sort of showing you, yes, something's actually happening there. Of course, if you get foreclosed on, you're going to have to move away. The reason it's not a 100 percentage point increase is because even those who don't get foreclosed on also move away some. So they're 30 percentage points more likely to move away. But we look at a whole host of outcomes in the paper, and we find that not only are those owners that are foreclosed more likely to move away, they're much more likely to have subsequent moves as well. So they're sort of going into this state of housing instability. So they're going to move once, they're going to move again, and they're going to move again. So they're not nearly as stable as they were prior to foreclosure. Not only are they moving a lot, we find they move to substantially worse neighborhoods in terms of neighborhood median income, in terms of the schools in the local area. So you're sort of moving down sort of into worse areas permanently, even 5 years later, which is as far as we can really look. In addition, it seems to be creating a lot of distress within the household. We find a 7 percentage point increase in divorce rates. So your housing is sort of getting up, stressing out probably both spouses. That's creating divorce. You're moving to areas with bad schools. You can imagine if you're a child in one of these households, finally moving to a worse school district and having your parents get a divorce could be especially stressful. So this could have a particularly big effect on kids growing up in these houses. And not surprisingly, we find a much lower home ownership rate. So these guys are much more likely to become renters. And then when we look at credit and financial outcomes, we find much more financial instability. So you're more likely to have a lot of your debt in collections, you're behind on other types of debt, just looking pretty bad for these owners across the board. When we move to landlords, though, who are also experiencing this financial loss, but aren't getting this additional eviction shock, things look a lot better. So maybe not surprisingly, they don't move away, because why would you move away from a house that you didn't get foreclosed on? The foreclosure is on some investment property that you are renting out. But most of the really bad stuff, like moving to worse areas, divorce, bankruptcy, we don't really see anything really going on there for the landlords. However, we do find some of the financial losses. So they're more likely to have debt in collections. They're more likely sort of to have worse credit outcomes. So the pure financial stuff, which the landlord is also experiencing, we do see landlords getting sort of negatively affected. But sort of relative to the magnitude of the, overall and economic shock to the owner-occupied households, the landlords are sort of not, it's not looking too bad. Finally, when we look at renters, here these renters basically are just getting evicted. If you're renting a property that eventually gets foreclosed on, it's very possible you're actually paying your rent every single month, and it's just the landlord who wasn't paying the mortgage. So there's not necessarily any kind of severe financial distress of these renters at the time of foreclosure. On top of that, some of these renters don't even know the property's in foreclosure, and then they just get this eviction notice that says you're evicted and you have to move out because the property's been foreclosed on. So you could think that potentially just getting evicted could be really detrimental for these renters. However, that's really not what we find. We find these renters maybe in the short run have a little bit more, than maybe they temporarily move to a slightly worse neighborhood, but within 2 or 3 years, it's back to sort of baseline. So it doesn't really seem like eviction per se has any long-term substantial consequences. Unlike the owner occupants, where we see these really persistent long-run effects. So it sort of suggests that the combination of eviction in a state of severe financial distress is when eviction can be really costly. But just sort of like eviction per se, like if I got evicted today from my home, I would probably be pretty upset and annoyed about it, but it's not clear I'd be really living somewhere substantially differently for 5 years from now. So just to conclude, in the Great Recession, I think policymakers severely underestimated the social cost of foreclosure because they really thought about it in terms of pure financial costs and benefits, but the non-pecuniary costs in terms of housing instability, worse neighborhoods, more divorce, those are very substantial permanent effects that we're finding that suggest that in the current sort of COVID crisis, you might expect this to get even more amplified because of the additional health risks of having to move a bunch or maybe having to move in with other people. So I would say that these are a lower bound on what you might expect this time around. However, renters and landlords, it's sort of the foreclosure aspect doesn't seem nearly as worrisome there. Obviously, the COVID aspect is still a big deal, but I would be wanting to do a lot of subsidizing policy that could mitigate foreclosure and potentially push people into a mortgage modification. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, for a great presentation. And I sure hope that we are not heading for another foreclosure crisis. And our final speaker today is Darrell Duffy. Darrell is the Adams Distinguished Professor of Management and a Professor of Finance at Stanford Graduate School of Business, as well as a Senior Fellow at CIPR. Darrell is a prolific scholar who published 9 books and dozens of articles. His research focuses on the design and regulation of financial markets. His most recent books include How Big Banks Fail, Measuring Corporate Default Risk, and Dark Markets. His new book, Fragmenting Markets, Post-Crisis Bank Regulations and Financial Market Liquidity, is forthcoming this year. Now, Darrell is a fellow of the Econometric Society, a research fellow of the National Bureau of Economic Research, a fellow of the American Finance Association, and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He was also the 2009 president of the American Finance Association. Darrell serves on the board of Dimensional Funds and was on the board of Moody's Corporation from 2008 to 2018. He chaired the Financial Stability Board's Market Participants Group on Reference Rate Reform, and Darrell is also a project advisor of the G30 Working Group on Digital Currencies. Welcome, Darrell, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Ren. It's a real pleasure. And I've been watching your series either live or on YouTube, and I'm so impressed at the range and quality of these presentations. So I'm humbled. I'm going to try to explain my focus on what happened in the COVID crisis, which, as you can imagine, is a focus on financial markets. And I've just spent the day until just now, I'm joining a bit late, speaking with 2 governors of the Federal Reserve System and a whole bunch of market participants and regulators about what happened to Treasury markets when the COVID crisis hit and became apparent in March of this year that we were going to go into a very large macroeconomic shock that would cast doubt on survivorship of many firms and also cost the Treasury Department an enormous amount of money that they would have to fund with more treasuries, possibly caused the Fed to lower interest rates for a long time, and was causing equity markets to really tumble. And on that macro news, Treasury markets just wilted. And it was, they not only went, the Treasuries not only lost market value, which is a shock because normally they're a safe haven in a crisis, they also, the prices became very volatile and it was very hard to trade Treasuries. The market became dysfunctional. And the official sector, and this is true globally, is trying to sort out what went wrong. And the Brookings Institution asked me to look into that. I wrote a paper and I just want to report a few of the things that I learned and possible prescription for what to do. And I'm going to hijack the title of your series, Democracy Matters, because I'm going to claim that democracy really does matter in the US Treasury market. First, let me give you, I'm going to share a screen. And I'm going to show you a few diagrams. Full screen. A few diagrams that will help motivate what I want to say. So the first diagram is just to illustrate the shock in the Treasury market, which was a massive amount of sales of US Treasuries to US banks. The banks are the ones that are the dealers in this market. So this diagram shows on the horizontal axis the amount in a given month of sales of US Treasuries to US dealers in trillions of dollars. And on the vertical axis, the frequency, how many months were there a given amount of sales. So you can see the kind of median number amount of sales in since the year 2000 is around $1.25 trillion, which is a lot. But in March of this year, that's the red dot way out there, the outlier, it was more than double that. It was just a total, what's called a dash for cash. Everyone was selling treasuries to get cash. And the dealers who have to intermediate this market were just overwhelmed. They could not handle the flow of trade. And that's really important because in the US Treasury market, let me give you, here's what happened to the bid offer spread in the market. So on the vertical axis is the bid offer spread, which is just indexed to 100 at the beginning of the year. So this diagram suggests that in the beginning part of the year, the bid offer spread, which is a measure of liquidity in the Treasury market, stayed very constant until March when the COVID crisis news hit. And bid offer spreads just exploded by a factor of more than 10, which means that it became very expensive to try to trade treasuries. And the reason for that is that the banks that intermediate this market just couldn't handle the flow. And I'm going to explain why that's the case in a minute. They just couldn't absorb all of these massive flows that I described. Why is this so important? It's because the US bond market is not democratic. It is a highly centralized intermediation system in which, as illustrated in this schematic, the green dots are the dealers and the blue dots are the customers. And as you can see, when any customer wants to sell a US Treasury security, they cannot sell it to anyone but a dealer. So if you have 2.7 trillion coming from foreign sales and a whole bunch more coming from US sales of treasuries, they all have to pass through these green dots somehow. And these green dots now are quite limited in terms of the flow they can handle, the flow that they can handle. And that story goes back to the previous financial crisis of 2008. And I'm going to explain why the green dots could not handle the flow and then what we need to do about that going forward. Okay, I'm going to spend a little while motivating this. There's only one more chart after this one. It's almost the same. So soon we'll be through all of the analytical side of this and we can talk about what to do. The horizontal axis here is time going back to 1998. And the vertical axis is measuring quantities in trillions of dollars, and there's 2 time series. The red bars are measuring the total amount of assets held by the largest US banks. So these are the banks that intermediate the lion's share of this market, of the treasury market. If you want to buy or sell a treasury security, most likely you're going to be, unless you're a retail investor, most likely you're going to be doing it through one of these large banks, whose names are illustrated at the bottom of the slide. Now, the red bars have a feature, which is leading up to the last financial crisis from 1998 to 2008 or 2007. Those bank balance sheets were exploding in size. They tripled over that 10-year period. And why is that? Well, that was the bad old days of light capital requirements and a presumption that these banks were just too big to fail. And so because of that, they were getting very cheap financing to buy treasuries and other assets, because the bank creditors said, hey, we can lend money to these banks at cheap interest rates because they're not going to fail. The government will rescue them if they get in trouble. Then the financial crisis hit in 2008, and US regulators completely changed the equation on too big to fail. They educated creditors that they would allow a large bank to fail. In fact, they brought in new rules that would help resolve a failing large bank. And they imposed very strong capital requirements on the banks, or maybe not strong enough, but much stronger than the capital requirements had been. And you can see what happened. The red bars stopped growing very fast. They're growing only very slowly now. Meanwhile, the blue bars are representing the amount of treasury securities outstanding that need to be intermediated in the market. And those are growing rapidly, but not as rapidly before the crisis as the banks were growing. So the banks were able to intermediate that market without difficulty. And when the crisis hit in 2008, there was no problem with the US Treasury market. It was a safe haven. Investors all around the world sought out US Treasuries. Their yields dropped, their prices rose. There was a stable, safe haven. When the COVID crisis news hit in 2008, however, I showed you what happened to the bid-offer spread in treasuries, and the prices of those treasuries was jumping up and down like crazy. I mean, basically the volatility was at astronomically high levels, and some days if you own, and for example, on a 2-day period in mid-March, if you owned the US 30-year treasury bond, you lost 10% of your market value, which is unheard of in a stress period. The problem here is that the blue bars are getting bigger and bigger. There's more and more treasury securities that need to be intermediated by the banks. These light blue bars here are projections for the next few years. The problem is getting worse because the COVID crisis itself has increased US deficits enormously, which means a lot more treasury securities need to be issued by the government to fund US deficits. You can see that the blue bars are overwhelming the red bars. So if we had difficulties in March with dealers being unable to handle the tremendous volume of sales of treasuries, then we're going to have much bigger problems going forward. Let me give you an idea of that. This week, the Congressional Budget Office announced projected amounts of US Treasuries outstanding for over the next 30 years. You can see that the blue bars are going to skyrocket up to 120 trillion of US Treasuries by the year 2050. So the next time that there's a COVID crisis or even a much smaller crisis, the amount of these treasuries that are sold is going to overwhelm the smaller red bars for the bank balance sheets. And we're going to be back in a situation like we had in March, in which the treasury market became dysfunctional. This is important because this is a matter of national economic security. The US government uses the treasury market to fund all of its fiscal deficits. And if the treasury market is not performing well, or if the prices of treasury securities are low, meaning taxpayers have to pay high interest rates on the national debt, it's going to be much worse for the US taxpayer. Moreover, the global safe haven status of the treasury market will be called into question, and that in turn will call into question the reserve currency status of the US dollar, which really rests on the treasury market as much as anything. The safety and soundness and depth and liquidity of the US Treasury market is a big anchor for the reserve currency status of the dollar. So this again is a matter of national economic security to figure out what one must do to fix this. And this is where democracy matters. I'm going to go back to this picture of how the market structure exists now and finish by just saying what I think needs to happen. I think we need to let the blue dots connect up with each other so that not every trade must go through a dealer, that trades can go on an exchange. And I think we should not rely on the dealers and the customers to handle all of the settlement of those trades. They should be centrally cleared in a clearinghouse so that the Treasury market becomes much safer. A clearinghouse is also a prerequisite for all-to-all trade. You can't have the blue dots trading with each other unless there's a clearinghouse that allows them to clear their trades centrally and guarantee performance on those trades, just like we have for stock markets. So this is where the US bond market is going to have to become more democratic in the sense of all-to-all trade and safer in order to handle the problem that we're looking at over the coming decades. So that's the gist of what I wanted to say. And if you want any more details, feel free to ask.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Darrell. This was super interesting. And as participants are now sending their questions using the Q&A function, I want to ask you all like a brief, like a big picture question that I know is on the mind of many people, not necessarily directly related to your talks. I wanted to ask you, how permanent do you think the economic effects of the pandemic will be? Do you think there will be like a long-term economic effects, as we saw in, like, of course, we saw this in Rebecca's talk, that we last long after the pandemic is gone? Or do you think the economy will get back quickly to the way it was before the pandemic hit? And maybe let's start with Susan.
Put me on the spot. So I think, this is, of course, a subject of a lot of speculation. So this is, I'll just give opinions, but I am concerned about certain segments of the population really falling behind in a more permanent way, similar to the Great Recession. So first of all, I want to highlight that there are groups that are really left out of a lot of the social safety nets that have been, say immigrants or people who, don't receive benefits. And then as we go along, depending on how we implement social insurance going forward, there may be more groups that are left behind. And so if people are, a lot of poor Americans don't have enough resources to deal with financial shocks. And so again, we're going to be very concerned about that. And then I think Rebecca also highlighted that a lot of the, stays on evictions and foreclosures have been temporary, and it's not clear how people are going to sort out those payments that were missed. With mortgages, you can stick them till the end, and that might be a good answer. For renters and landlords, it's less clear how to divide the pain between the renter and the landlord. So I think there's a lot of TBD here, and we really need governments to step in, and we have a challenge because the states also don't have the ability to borrow the way the federal government does. But so the federal government is really our primary answer for a lot of social safety net issues.
Great. Nick, do you have anything to add?
I was just going to say, I'm working from home. Yes, it's clearly going to stick. I think that was the main point of my talk. It's going to be a pretty permanent change in the way societies are operated. And we're going to see most of us, of Stanford graduates, we would typically in future be working from home probably a couple of days a week, whereas before COVID, that wasn't going to happen. So if you like working from home, that's great. Katie asked in the Q&A, the other big implication I think is for cities. So as we know, Rebecca's worked in the cities have seen relative growth since the 1980s. If you go back to 1980, a lot of city centers were kind of scary, dangerous places with crack gangs. And now in 2019, the center of cities were the most expensive real estate around. That's reversing. My next door neighbor just actually left San Francisco and moved to Stanford campus. And he said rents are down by about a third in San Francisco. I think there's going to be a pretty dramatic drop in residential and commercial property prices in the center of big cities. We're seeing it already. So yeah, it's not like everyone will leave San Francisco. They just won't live in the center. They'll live, you know, a 45-minute commute away. I mean, the economics is kind of obvious. If you're only going to be commuting 3 days a week, you're spending more time at home and less time commuting. Therefore, it makes sense to move further out.
Great. Rebecca?
So I'll follow up a little bit on Nick's point on housing in cities. I think some of it is actually a little bit more temporary than we might think. I think the exodus from big cities we're seeing right now is very much young single people that are sort of moving back in with their parents and stuff. So I think there'll be some return to central cities once you can consume the sort of urban amenities. But I think the desirability to work in central cities for commuting reasons will dramatically decline. So you won't really want to live there to be close to your job, but it's not totally obvious that it'll make cities per se decline. I think the consumer aspect of cities, once we can actually go to restaurants again, will still be there. I think a city like San Francisco is likely to be declining because it is both such a tech and job hub in addition to a consumer hub. But cities that are actually not as expensive, that offer decent consumer amenities, you actually might see those even grow, where people work there, live there, but then maybe work, you know, in somewhere that's not at all located there. So you can kind of decouple the consumer city from the producer city now. I think that will have pretty large reallocation effects. And San Francisco, I think, is going to get the decline on that because the producer aspect of San Francisco, we have super work from home type jobs in tech. But you could imagine some of the less known cities might actually grow in density, and you might see more urban amenities like, you know, in smaller cities like Kansas City or places in Florida that are not as well known. Those might actually become even more consumer cities than they used to be.
Great, thank you. Darrell?
Well, I already mentioned one of the long-lasting effects, which is a huge deficit, $3 trillion this year. And that's going to be an intergenerational transfer. That's not going to get paid back soon. We're going to continue to run enormous deficits, a lot of that due to this crisis. There's two questions about the duration of impact. One is, how long is it going to take for the COVID crisis to reduce a significant impact? I think that's going to be quite a while. And once it's over, I think the US economy is structurally quite flexible and adaptable. There are costs and benefits to light regulation of markets in the US, but one of the benefits is that US markets are pretty flexible, and output will, I think, resume pretty quickly. In fact, we've seen a lot of adapted behavior already, changes in technology and job types and so on. The problem, I think, is the one that Susan mentioned, which is a lot of that output is not going to go where it needs to go. There's going to be even greater, possibly, inequality because those, the Amazons of the world that are benefiting from this restructuring are not necessarily going to redistribute that wealth to the lower part of the income distribution. So that and the social stresses that come from that are probably the longest lasting and most problematic that I see coming out of this.
Great, thanks. And next week we are going to talk about actually inequality, and the week after that we are going to talk about immigration. So this is a great segue for that. So let's turn to questions from the audience. And today this is my opportunity to showcase some of our great graduate students. And today I want to invite Tamri Matiashvili to moderate the Q&A. Tamri grew up in Georgia, the country, not the state, and came to the United States to attend Middlebury College in Vermont. Tamri will be starting her PhD in the economics department at Stanford next fall. Her research so far focuses on economic development of Imperial Russia in the late 19th century. So thank you so much, Tamri, for joining and moderating the Q&A today.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you all speakers for the fascinating talks. I'll jump right in with the first question. It's for Professor Athey. Could you please talk more about why there are diminishing returns to vaccinating the rest of the population and not frontline workers or elderly?
Sure. So one aspect is just epidemiological. So, as you get a higher share of the population vaccinated, you get herd immunity. And so there's less need for vaccinating the final people. A second thing is that different people might face different risks. So like I'm just sitting at home in my house on Stanford campus, I'm not going anywhere. So although I would like to be vaccinated, there's not as much externality from vaccinating me. So we used epidemiological models to get those diminishing returns modeled.
Thank you, Professor Athey. And the second question we have is for Professor Bloom. What do you think is the key to overcome the rapidly declining mental health engendered by work from home? And will people gradually acclimatize to their lower levels of in-person contact and the detrimental emotional effects diminish?
I mean, the mental health issue is a huge challenge. I'm not sure there's a lot we can easily do to fix it. So, I mean, the issue is just the lack of interpersonal connection, and this has come up. I mean, I was impressed. I had a couple of panels with one was a tech and one finance CEOs, and they both raised this, the things they're really concerned about with their employees. So it's, it's from the bottom up and top down. It's one of the big drivers for why firms are trying to get back to working on premises as fast as they can. But I don't think, to give you some numbers, very few firms are planning to do that before the vaccine comes along. So we are seeing some return to working on premises, but that's not tech firms and not finance firms. So until that happens, yeah, it's a huge challenge. I mean, the kind of things you hear from managers is, for example, they'll say they're trying to have daily meetings with their employees to check in on each person. So if you have 6 people you manage, for each person, you try and check in for 10 minutes a day. They have chit chat around meetings, but it's genuinely a really hard issue. Actually, it's one of the issues. It's like a building crisis, because what we saw in China for people working from home, and the mental health issues started to pick up at kind of 4 or 5 months. And by the time we got to 9 months, we ran this experiment and everyone had volunteered to work from home, but then randomized whether they got to work from home or not. At the end of 9 months, they could re-choose. And half the people that initially volunteered changed their minds. They said, I want to come back into the office. And we asked them why, and it was basically loneliness. That's really depressing and lonely working from home. And so I think it's a major driver people's views on working from home, and why not that many people do want to work from home full time. Most people want to work from home 2-3 days a week and spend the rest of the time in the office.
I see. Thank you so much, Professor Bloom. And then our next question was for Professor Diamond. Do you see racial inequities in judges' decisions? And if so, how can we prevent the pandemic from causing even more racial inequality?
So we looked into that, and we didn't really see different treatment by different judges based on race. So we didn't really have the ability to say whether all judges were sort of especially strict or especially lenient by race, but it didn't really look like in the data that the judges who were lenient on white homeowners were not lenient on Black homeowners, let's say. So we didn't really see that going on. Granted, I should add the caveat that sort of statistically, we only could pick up that if it was a pretty sizable effect. If it was a pretty small effect that was sort of within the statistical noise, we wouldn't really be able to see it. But there's definitely not dramatically different effects.
Thank you, Professor Dan. And then the fourth question is for Professor Duffy. Given the negative treasury predictions you just presented, do you see the global financial market gravity centers shifting towards other countries such as China, as many people seem to fear at the moment in the US?
That's a great question. I'm actually teaching a graduate course right now on China's financial system. They're having their own stresses and strains, but they're doing better right now than the US. And the long run of history shows that the fastest, largest growing commercial centers tend to become also the largest financial centers. So over the next 50 years, perhaps Shanghai will take over from New York and London. But there's also issues about China's capital controls. It's not easy to ship capital in and out of China. And as we've been reading about what's happening in Hong Kong, there are disagreements about individual liberties, and it's not clear whether that will be consistent with having a very strong financial center. But one thing is clear: the United States should not take it for granted that it will remain the powerhouse financial center of the world, along with London, forever. For now, though, some research, for example, by Pierre-Olivier Gourenchat at Berkeley, convinces me that it's going to be quite a few years before that changes, just given the dominance of the dollar.
Thank you. And going back to Professor Athey, who or what organizations should be the leaders in designing frameworks for international cooperation in terms of vaccines?
What organizations? Well, that actually is a really good question. And one thing that slowed down our response to this pandemic was that it really wasn't clear at the beginning who was in charge. So we have organizations like CEPI and Gavi that have been devoted to vaccines, primarily focused on poorer countries, and also organizations like the Gates Foundation or the Clinton Global Health Initiative that have built up over a period of time kind of expertise in sourcing vaccines for public good across a lot of countries. And then, of course, countries have their own facilities. Like the United States has organizations like BARDA, which are part of the Department of Defense, that have created capacity that's flexible to be able to quickly manufacture vaccines if we thought there was something that threatened our military. So there is that kind of expertise and infrastructure built out, but it was not built out to, say, coordinate richer countries. And it was not really set up to think about something on the speed and scale of what we have now. So it seems like going forward that we would want something a little more dedicated. My group actually has talked to a large set of organizations. We've talked to probably 15 countries or 20 countries. Often the finance ministers are very involved because they're doing the financing. And one of the nice things is that the finance ministries have economists, so they think about incentives, which is something that we think is very important as well. So one type of collaboration could be through finance ministers who actually would also be putting together the contracts that support this. But then there needs to be sort of a separate thinking about on the health side. And so overall, we need, whatever the institutional environment is, what's really important is that you have frameworks settled in advance, that you've decided about things like export controls. Like, is there a contract I can write so that the United States can contract with an Indian or a French or, you know, a Brazilian manufacturer and be confident that their contract will be honored by the government? One thing you've seen is a lot of countries have been investing in domestic candidates. And I think that fear about supply chain issues and control have been important drivers of that. And that's, for the US, we have actually a fair bit of capacity, but there are a lot of countries that don't. And that has led, I think, to underinvestment. So overall, there's a few options of who should be in charge, but the most important thing is that actually just people sit down and figure out a framework so that they can just push go on that framework rather than starting from scratch and not even know who they're supposed to be talking to. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Athey. Professor Bloom, what have you previously observed as key indicators of a company's readiness for transition to more work from home? And is there a reason to believe the pandemic has elevated readiness in terms of these key indicators?
You know, what was really interesting is that when I spoke to Marissa Mayer about a month ago, so I'll give you the history of this. Marissa Mayer was a Stanford undergrad, in fact, and she became the celebrity CEO of Yahoo. And she took over in 2013, she banned working from home. And it turned into like this massive media storm. Probably most people remember it. She was all over the press and she was saying it was like a nightmare. It was like 2-3 weeks she was just getting hounded by journalists. And in fact, I emailed her to ask to talk to her. And she said, oh, I'm still getting chased by journalists. I won't talk to them, but you're a Stanford professor, so okay. So I was like, great. And I asked her about it. And she basically said like a very econ type response, which is, you can either manage people based on inputs or on outputs. So to explain, managing people based on outputs is what we want to be managed. For me, it would be like on teaching or research. And Stanford would say, kind of get on with your job, but as long as you teach well and do research, you're fine. Managing based on inputs, it's like they watch what I'm doing and they have a camera or they're walking around and watching me at my desk, sitting there. Now you can imagine, you know, bad management is basically pretty synonymous with input-based management. And that doesn't work very well at home. So you can get away with running a firm whereby you can kind of the managers walking around, checking out what people are doing by snooping on them. But if you send them home, it's a disaster. And these are the same firms that then think, oh, I can't manage what's going on. I'm going to use this surveillance software. So I spoke to a company that makes this software that like records every keystroke and takes random snapshots of your screen. And it seems really invasive, and it is, but the reason firms are doing that is their HR system is, not very good. They're input-based managers. So the bottom line is, it turns out firms that have good HR systems, so can evaluate employees based on what they achieve, have done pretty well. They're okay. You go home and just get on with your job. We're going to evaluate them as before. Firms that are disorganized or chaotic and basically, had a be at your desk to be working culture have really struggled. So, and that's what Marissa said. She said when she took over at Yahoo, she discovered they had poor performance management. She put the performance management system into place, and later in 2013, she reinstigated working from home, and it was fun.
Thank you, Professor Bloom, for the comprehensive answer. And this is going to be the last question for Professor Diamond. Are you aware of any similar pandemic-related policies helping homeowners in other countries than the US that the US may consider adopting? And more generally, are we already seeing a rise in foreclosures around the world as well?
So I admit to not knowing all the details of all the different countries have handled this. My sense is most countries have just sort of kicked the ball down the road right now, just because it didn't seem like the first order problem to solve. It was more just, let's not kick people out of their homes and then solve the COVID crisis and then come back to this. That said, even the current moratorium on evictions and foreclosures has, current effects right now. It can be actually quite hard to get a mortgage right now, or even to put down an enormous security deposit to rent a home, because landlords and banks don't have the normal tools to make sure that you actually keep paying your rent or keep paying your mortgage. So it's a little bit of a unique time if you're actually trying to move into a new rental or buy a home. Interest rates are low and rents look low in a lot of big cities, but then you actually might talk to the landlord and realize he wants you to pay a year of rent up front before you move in. So it's the current policies are already having impacts now, even though we haven't worked out how to get back to people paying their mortgages and rents that are already in place.
Well, thank you so much, Susan, Nick, Rebecca, Darrell, and Tamri. This was a really insightful discussion, and thank you so much for coming. And next week, we are going to talk about another big topic, income inequality in the US, and whether and how and what we should do about it. So thanks again for everyone.